In the high social season of 1815, London's glittering salons were consumed by one burning question. Who could ever melt the heart of the Frost Lord of Grosvenor Square? Lord Gideon Ravenscroft was the most eligible yet untouchable bachelor in England. He hadn't just rejected the season's debutantes, he had withered them with a single icy glance. He believed he was a fortress, safe behind walls of wealth and cynicism. But arrogance is a fragile shield. He thought he controlled his destiny until he walked into a trap set by the one person he couldn't intimidate. She wasn't a duchess, she wasn't an heiress. She was the one woman his grandmother had chosen to bring him to his knees. This is the story of a pride that shattered and a love that burned through the ice. If you're already hooked on this fiery tale of a stubborn lord and the one woman who could shatter his ice, smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. My granny always says if this channel gets to 1,000 subscribers, she'll finally share her secret stash of Regency love letters with me. And trust me, they're spicier than any ballroom scandal. Drop a comment. Where are you listening from today? London fog, Benin city heat, or somewhere in between? Your likes and subs help us keep these heart-racing stories coming. Don't let the ton win by keeping them to yourself. The fog in Mayfair did not hide the city's secrets. It merely muffled the sound of them breaking. For Lord Gideon Ravenscroft, the mist was a welcome companion, cold, impenetrable, and unconcerned with the trivialities of polite society. At 32, Gideon was a man who wore his isolation like a suit of armor. He possessed the kind of dark, wavy-haired beauty that stopped conversation when he entered a room, and the stormy gray eyes that started rumors when he left it. He strode through the mahogany doors of his townhouse, shaking the dampness from his impeccable burgundy velvet coat, ignoring the footman reaching for his cane. He stripped off his gloves with lethal precision. The air inside smelled of beeswax and roses, a deceptive warmth. "You're late, Gideon." The voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a diamond on glass. He entered the drawing room. Lady Beatrice Montfort sat by the hearth, resplendent in a gown of rose-gold satin that caught the firelight. At 58, she was not the frail creature society assumed. She was an empress waiting for tribute, her auburn hair pinned beneath a ruby coronet that gleamed as dangerously as her green eyes. "I was avoiding the matchmakers, grandmother," Gideon clipped, pouring a brandy to dull the edge of his irritation. "They circle like vultures." "Run all you like," Bay said, her gaze fixing on him with terrifying resolve. "But the running stops tonight. I have chosen your bride, Gideon, and you will not refuse me." Gideon let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed off the high, plastered ceilings of the drawing room. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his stormy gray eyes narrowing as he regarded the matriarch of his family. To the rest of London, he was the untouchable earl, a predator in a bespoke burgundy velvet coat who prowled the ballrooms only to sneer at the offerings. But here, in the sanctuary of his own home, he felt the walls of his fortress shuddering under siege. "You speak of marriage as if it were a sentencing, grandmother," he said, his voice smooth but laced with danger. "I have told you, I will not shackle myself to some vapid chit who cares only for the Ravenscroft diamonds and the size of my estate." Lady Beatrice did not flinch. She sat rigid in her high-backed chair, the rose-gold satin of her gown rustling like dry leaves as she leaned forward. The ruby coronet, nestled in her auburn hair, caught the flicker of the candlelight, casting a blood-red shadow across her brow. "And I have told you, Gideon, that your pride will be the death of this line. But since you lack the wisdom to act, I have found the leverage to force your hand." She reached into the folds of her silk skirts and withdrew a parchment yellowed with age and sealed with wax. "The 1740 Entailment," she announced, placing it on the table between them with a heavy thud. a forgotten clause, but valid. If the heir remains unwed by his 33rd year, the stewardship and the income reverts to the Dowager until a suitable union is made. You have 3 months, Gideon. Marry my choice or lose your fortune." The silence that followed was deafening. Gideon's grip tightened on his glass until the crystal threatened to snap. He looked at the woman who had raised him, searching for a bluff, but found only steel in her green eyes. He was trapped. The Frost Lord, outmaneuvered by an old woman in lace. "Fine," he snarled, setting the glass down with a violence that made the liquid jump. "Name the victim. Which title are you buying? Which duke's daughter have you bribed?" Beatrice smiled, a small, triumphant curve of her lips that unsettled him more than her anger. "No title, Gideon, no fortune. You need a wife who sees the man, not the earl." She paused, letting the air thicken. "I have chosen Ilara Voss." Gideon froze. The name hung in the air, foreign yet startlingly familiar. Ilara, the quiet companion, the woman who moved through this very house like a ghost, organizing Beatrice's correspondence, her presence so modest he had barely deigned to notice her for years. He pictured her, dark hair, watchful eyes, always on the periphery. He had expected a grand name, a socialite. Instead, Beatrice had chosen a nobody. And yet, as her name settled in his mind, the icy indifference he had cultivated for a decade developed a hairline fracture. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to escape. He was wondering why, of all the women in England, the mere mention of the invisible Miss Voss made his pulse hammer a warning beat against his ribs. The chandeliers of the Weatherby ballroom blazed like 1,000 accusing eyes, casting a harsh brilliance over the sea of pastel silk and desperation. Gideon moved through the crush, his expression bored, parting the crowd of hopeful debutantes like a shark gliding through a koi pond. He was looking for a mouse, expecting to find Ilara Voss cowering in a corner, likely draped in something drab and gray to match her status as a paid companion. He intended to get this farce over with, to dance one duty dance and satisfy Beatrice's theatrics. Then the crowd shifted, and the air left his lungs. She stood near the terrace doors, not in the invisible wool of a servant, but in sapphire silk that clung to her form, the deep, vibrant blue making her pale skin look luminous. Beatrice's hand was evident in the cut of the gown, but the gown only framed what Gideon had blindly ignored for years, the elegant arch of her neck and the defiant tilt of her chin. She looked less like a companion and more like a queen in exile. He strode toward her, the sound of his boots lost under the swell of the orchestra, but the silence that rippled outward from his path was unmistakable. When he reached her, Ilara turned. She didn't flinch. She didn't drop a curtsy of subservience. She met his stormy gaze with eyes that were clear, intelligent, and shockingly unafraid. "My grandmother plays a dangerous game, Miss Voss," Gideon murmured, extending a gloved hand, a challenge rather than an invitation. "Lady Montfort plays to win, my lord," Ilara replied, her voice low but steady, lacking the tremors he was accustomed to inspiring. "I am merely the pawn she has pushed across the board to checkmate you." A spark, hot and unfamiliar, flared in Gideon's chest. He swept her onto the floor without waiting for an answer. The waltz was a scandal in motion. He held her too close, his hand burning against the silk at her waist. He expected her to falter, to stammer apologies for her low birth. Instead, as they spun, she matched his steps with a grace that mocked the clumsiness of the high-born ladies he had spurned. "You dance as if you are marching to war, Lord Gideon," she whispered, breathless but bold. "Perhaps I am," he countered, staring down into her face, mesmerizingly close. "And you are the weapon." "I am no weapon," she said, a sad, wry smile touching her lips, a moment of raw honesty that cut through the artifice of the ballroom. "I am just the inconvenience you are forced to endure to keep your fortune." That truth, stark and unadorned amidst a room of lies, struck him harder than any physical blow. He stopped dead in the center of the floor. The music swirled on, but the dancers around them stumbled to a halt, sensing the disruption. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that for the first time in his life, a woman was speaking to him, not his title. "Then let us be inconvenient together," Gideon announced, his voice carrying over the sudden suffocating hush of the room. He didn't care about the gasps, the fluttering fans, or the shock wave ripping through the ton. "Miss Voss, I have no patience for courtship, and even less for the rules of this assembly. Marry me." The vows had been spoken in a whirlwind ceremony that left the ton gasping for air, the ink on the marriage license barely dry before the gossip sheets branded the union the scandal of the century. A paid companion rising to the rank of countess was an upheaval of the natural order, a direct affront to every debutante who had spent seasons perfecting her embroidery for this very prize. Yet within the heavy velvet-draped walls of Ravenscroft House, the chaos of the outside world felt miles away. Gideon found himself observing his new wife with a fascination he had not anticipated. He had expected a mouse to scurry about the edges of his life, grateful for the roof provided by the entailment's demands. Instead, he found a partner. One evening in the library, he caught Ilara correcting an error in his estate ledgers, her finger tracing the columns of figures with practiced ease. When he confronted her, she didn't apologize. She explained the discrepancy in grain yields with a logic that rivaled his own steward's. The Frost Lord felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. Respect. For the first time, the silence in the house wasn't heavy with isolation. It was companionable. The ice around his heart wasn't shattering. It was melting, drop by slow drop, under the steady light of her intelligence. But Ilara carried a weight she dared not share. Her elevation to countess had given her access to funds she desperately needed, not for jewels, but for life itself. Hidden beneath her layers of new silk was a secret loyalty to her younger sister, Clara, who wasted away in a drafty boarding house on the edge of Cheapside. Society dictated that a woman of Ilara's former station should cut ties with her humble past to preserve the dignity of her new title, but Ilara could not abandon her blood. Under the guise of charity visits, she slipped away to deliver medicine and comfort, unaware that eyes were watching from the shadows. Lord Harlan Crowe, Gideon's cousin, and the man who would have inherited the earldom had the entailment failed, sat in his carriage, watching Ilara disappear into the squalid tenement. A cruel smile twisted his lips. He saw not a sister's devotion, but the perfect weapon to sever the fragile trust growing between the newlyweds. He didn't need the truth. He only needed the appearance of deceit. The blow landed 2 days later at breakfast. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating a scene of domestic peace that Gideon was just beginning to cherish. Then the butler presented a silver tray. On it lay a single letter, sealed with no crest, the handwriting jagged and hurried. Gideon broke the seal, his eyes scanning the contents. The warmth vanished from his face instantly, replaced by the old, terrifying winter. He looked up, the gray of his irises churning like a storm at sea, and fixed Ilara with a stare that could freeze blood. The honeymoon was over. The paper fluttered to the floor between them, landing like a gauntlet. It was a report meticulously forged by Harlan Crow's agents detailing Ilara's secretive trips to a dilapidated boarding house in Cheapside, but the report did not speak of a sick sister. It spoke of a lover. It listed payments made to a Mr. Silas Thorne, the landlord to whom Ilara paid Clara's rent, framed as the hush money of an unfaithful wife keeping a sordid affair. Gideon stood by the fireplace, his back to her, the line of his shoulders rigid with a tension that terrified her more than his shouting ever could. The air in the room had dropped 20 degrees. When he turned, the man who had begun to thaw over the last few weeks was gone. In his place stood the Frost Lord, his eyes 2 chips of glacial slate, void of all light. "I trusted you," Gideon said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "I let you into my home, into my accounts, into my life, and all the while you were funding another man's bed with my coin." "Ilara, no!" Ilara pleaded, stepping forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "It is not what it seems. Silas Thorne is a landlord. I go to care for—" "Do not lie to me." The roar shattered the calm, causing the crystal decanters to rattle. "The evidence is irrefutable. Harlan saw you enter. The bank drafts bear your signature. You are just like the rest, calculating, deceitful, common." He advanced on her, and for the first time, Ilara stepped back. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute, a mirror of old wounds she had no part in inflicting but was now destined to pay for. He pointed a trembling finger toward the heavy oak doors. "Leave. Take your things and go. If you are still here by nightfall, I will have the servants remove you." If this betrayal twists your heart like it does mine, subscribe now. Don't risk missing the redemption that could heal even the coldest soul. Those who skip, tell me in comments why you'd leave such a story unfinished. Your regret might haunt you worse than Gideon's. Ilara did not beg. She saw the impenetrable wall of his pain and knew that words would not breach it today. With a dignity that shamed his fury, she turned without a tear, though her heart was fracturing in her chest. She packed only the modest dress she had arrived in, leaving behind the silks and the jewels, taking nothing of the Ravenscroft fortune. She stepped out of the townhouse and into the encroaching twilight. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. Mayfair was cold, but the wind picking up from the Thames carried the scent of ozone and rain. Ilara vanished into the deepening shadows, a solitary figure against the gloom, unaware that the heavens were conspiring to match the devastation in her soul. The storm was coming, and it would show no mercy to the just or the damned. The humble room in Cheapside smelled of damp wool and sickness, a stark cry from the lavender-scented halls of Grosvenor Square. Ilara sat by the bedside of her sleeping sister, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the rain hammer against the thin roof. 3 days had passed since her exile, 3 days of silence that felt heavier than the poverty she had returned to. She told herself she was better off without the Earl's volatile temper, yet every beat of her heart seemed to echo his name. Across the city, Gideon was waging a war against himself. The silence of his empty house was maddening, the ghost of Ilara's presence lingering on every surface. To drown the memories, he turned to speed and danger. Ignoring the pleas of his aging butler, Higgins, Gideon ordered his high-perch phaeton brought around, demanding the most spirited grays in the stable. The sky was a bruising purple, swelling with an approaching tempest, but the Frost Lord cared little for the weather. He sought a violence outside to match the one within. He did not know that his carriage had been touched by human malice before the storm could even reach it. Lord Harlan, lurking in the shadows of the mews, had done his work well. A loosened linchpin, a weakened axle, invisible death traps set to spring under strain. Gideon drove the horses hard towards Hampstead Heath, the wind whipping his coat like a tattered flag. The rain began to fall in sheets, turning the road to a river of mud. He urged the team faster, seeking oblivion in the rush of wind. Then, as he rounded a sharp bend near the ravine, disaster struck. A sickening crack echoed over the thunder. The left wheel sheared off, sending the carriage lurching violently. The world spun, sky, mud, wood, and then darkness. The phaeton shattered against an ancient oak, pinning Gideon beneath the wreckage, the iron of the carriage crushing his leg, the rising floodwaters of the ditch beginning to lap at his face. News traveled through the servants' network with the speed of the lightning splitting the sky. A stable boy, who had once received a kind word and a coin from the banished countess, ran through the deluge to Cheapside. He arrived at Alara's door, soaked and breathless. "My lady," he gasped, shivering on the threshold. "It's the Earl. The carriage. He's trapped in the ravine. They say he won't last the night." Alara's world tilted. The betrayal, the cruel words, the banishment, all of it evaporated in the face of the terrible, singular truth. Gideon was dying. Pride whispered that he had cast her out, that he deserved his fate. But love, fierce and unyielding, silenced the doubt. She grabbed her cloak, not waiting for a carriage, and stepped out into the howling dark. If he was to die, he would not die alone in the rain. The mud of Hampstead Heath was a greedy thing, clinging to Alara's ham and threatening to drag her down with every step, but she ran with a desperation that defied the elements. Lightning bifurcated the sky, illuminating the ravine in stark, terrifying flashes. There, amidst the splintered oak and iron, lay the wreckage of the phaeton, half submerged in the rising floodwaters. "Gideon!" Her scream tore through the thunder. She slid down the embankment, ignoring the jagged debris that tore at her hands. He was pinned beneath the crushed cabin, his face pale as death, the rising water lapping dangerously close to his chin. He blinked, his stormy eyes unfocused and glazed with pain. "Gideon," he rasped, the sound barely audible. You are a hallucination." "I am your wife," she sobbed, grabbing his shoulders to keep his head above the water, "and I will not let you die." She turned to the two burly hostlers she had bribed from a roadside inn to follow her. "Heave! For the love of God, heave!" Under her command, the men strained against the sodden weight of the carriage. With a groan of twisting metal, the pressure lifted just enough. Alara dragged Gideon free, collapsing with him onto the muddy bank, just as the carriage settled back into the mire with a sickening crunch. Hours later, the silence of the Ravenscroft master bedroom was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Gideon lay bandaged and broken, the haze of laudanum receding enough to reveal the figure slumped in the chair beside him. Alara was still in her muddy dress, her hand gripping his as if she were the anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. "Why?" Gideon whispered, his voice rough. "I cast you out." "Because you are a fool, Gideon," came a sharp voice from the doorway. Lady Beatrice marched in, not with a cane, but with the full force of her authority. Behind her stood two grim-faced Bow Street runners holding a man in irons, Lord Harlan Crowe. "My investigation was more thorough than yours, grandson," Beatrice declared, pointing a trembling finger at Harlan. "The wheel was sawed. Attempted murder to secure a title he could never earn." As the runners dragged Harlan cursing away, the truth settled in the room like dust after a collapse. Gideon looked at Alara, at the mud on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the fierce loyalty that had saved his life. Harlan forged the report, Gideon," Elara said softly, her thumb brushing his knuckles. "Silas Thorne is not my lover, Gideon. He is the landlord of the tenement where my sister, Clara, lies ill. I was not hiding an affair. I was hiding my poverty and the love for the only family I had left." The Frost Lord felt the last of his armor shatter. He had nearly died for his pride, and the woman he had discarded had walked through hell to bring him back. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, pricked his eyes. "Elara," he choked out, squeezing her hand with his remaining strength. "Forgive me." Recovery was a slow, humbling road for the Earl of Ravenscroft, but for the first time in his life, Gideon did not walk it alone. As soon as he was fit to travel, leaning heavily on a cane that matched his grandmother's, he did not go to the House of Lords or his clubs. He ordered the carriage to Cheapside. He did not merely visit, he orchestrated an exodus. With the same commanding presence that at once cleared ballrooms, Gideon swept Clara Wass from her squalid lodgings and installed her in the sunniest suite of Ravenscroft House, surrounding her with the finest physicians London could offer. Standing in the library one evening, watching Elara laugh as she read to her recovering sister, Gideon finally confronted the ghost in the mirror. He had built a fortress to keep pain out, only to lock loneliness in. He wrapped his arms around Elara from behind, resting his chin on her hair. "I looked for enemies in the shadows and missed the only light that ever mattered. Everything I have, Elara, my fortune, my name, my life, means nothing without you." Time, the great healer, smoothed the jagged edges of their beginning. 5 years later, the once silent townhouse in Grosvenor Square vibrated with the sound that would have terrified the old Gideon: chaos. A Christmas gathering was in full swing. Lady Beatrice, now frail but sharp as ever, sat by the fire holding a new heir on her lap, looking at her grandson with vindicated pride. Gideon stood by the mantel, no longer the predator in burgundy velvet, but a man at peace. His stormy gray eyes, once famous for withering debutantes, were now crinkled with warmth as he watched his wife. Elara moved through the room, radiant not because of the Ravenscroft diamonds at her throat, but because of the unshakable love that surrounded her. She caught his gaze across the room, and the connection between them was a tangible force, a fire that no winter could ever extinguish. As snow began to fall outside, dusting the London streets in white, the cold remained firmly beyond the glass. Inside, the Earl raised his glass to the woman who had dared to challenge him. The Frost Lord was gone, melted away by the only fire strong enough to consume him. He had learned, through near tragedy and redemption, that true treasure was not locked in iron vaults or family entailments. It lay in the hand that held his, and the heart that had seen the man beneath the ice and loved him anyway.